My name is Thomas Blake, and in the summer of 2019, I took a job that I thought would change my life for the better. In a way, it did. Just not how I expected. I was 34, recently divorced, and burned out from over a decade working private security in Los Angeles. My doctor had been warning me for years about stress, and after the divorce I finally listened. I cashed out some savings and applied for a ranger position through the National Park Service. I wanted peace, solitude, a simpler life. The job offer came from a small, isolated park in northern Utah called Pine Reach. I'd never heard of it. The place barely existed online. Just a few vague mentions in backcountry hiking forums and a couple of grainy satellite photos. When I asked about it, the recruiter just said it was a quiet, underfunded district that needed a steady hand. That was fine with me. The station was a small wooden structure about 20 miles off the nearest paved road, surrounded by towering pine forests and jagged limestone ridges. The kind of place where time seemed to slow down. The ranger I was replacing, a guy named McCready, didn't stick around to give me a proper handover. I arrived early in the afternoon. By dusk, his cabin was empty. The first week was uneventful. Peaceful, even. I patrolled the trails, restocked signs, cleared fallen branches, checked the campground, empty, the fire watchtower, creaky but functional, and the station radio always quiet. But the nights were strange. It wasn't the usual forest noises that kept me up. I've camped enough to know how animals move at night. No, this was different. The air would get still, too still. No wind, no crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then the feeling would come of pressure in my skull, like I was being watched. Studied? Around the fifth night, I woke to the sound of static. The station radio had turned itself on. I stumbled out of bed and walked into the main office, expecting a weather alert or garbled message from another ranger. But all I heard was this deep, warbling static, almost rhythmic, almost like breathing. I turned it off. Checked the wiring the next morning. Nothing wrong with it. 2 days later, I found the totem. I was hiking a rarely used trail near the southern boundary when I saw it. Something hanging from a tree, about 7 feet up. A strange wooden figure, carved from twisted branches and bound with what looked like old sinew or tendon. Human-shaped, but wrong. Its arms were too long. Its head was just a spiral of wood. I radioed it in. No response. When I returned the next day to take a photo, it was gone. Over the next week, I started noticing other signs. Deep gouges in tree bark. Strange prints in the mud near the stream elongated, almost hoof-like, but asymmetrical. A set of scratches on the supply shed door that hadn't been there before. Then came the dreams, always the same. I'm walking through the forest at night, drawn by the sound of a bell, a slow, solemn tolling that echoes through the trees. The forest changes around me. The trees twist, the moon vanishes, and then I see it. Not clearly, just a shape, tall, thin, antlers maybe, eyes like lanterns, watching me, and always just before I wake I hear a voice. You're not supposed to be here. I spent the rest of that sleepless night huddled in the watchtower, shotgun in lap, eyes fixed on the black expanse of trees that stretched into forever. Every creak of the wooden frame made my heart jump. Every gust of wind was a whisper too close. I don't remember dozing off, but when I blinked awake, The sun was rising, pale and indifferent over the forest like nothing had happened. I radioed dispatch again, repeating the story I'd told the night before, this time calmer, more collected. They'd promised to send backup, but warned me not to go searching alone. They didn't have to. I wasn't planning on leaving the tower until I saw another living soul, and even then, I wasn't so sure I'd believe they were real. Around noon, a Forest Service chopper buzzed in from the south, cutting a slow, cautious arc over the valley. When it touched down in the field near the ranger station, 3 figures disembarked. One of them I recognized. Ranger Eric Malone, mid-50s, all gravel and calluses. He'd trained half the rookies in our division and could smell a hoax before it was even hatched. He looked different today. He didn't speak right away, just stood there with his boots planted in the grass, squinting at the tree line like it owed him money. This where it happened? He finally asked, nodding toward the tower. His voice was low, serious. I nodded. About 200 yards north, right where trail 6 cuts behind the ridge. And you're sure you saw it, this figure? I didn't just see it, I said. I heard it, felt it. It was there, Eric. You know, I'm not the type to scare easy. He nodded once, grim. I believe you, he said, and those words scared me more than if he'd called me crazy. We spent the day combing the area with the other 2 guys from the chopper. One a tracker named Flynn, the other some quiet guy in plain clothes who never gave his name. While Malone and I checked the ridge, Flynn scanned the perimeter for prints or scat. The quiet guy took readings with a handheld Geiger counter. Not something you see often in forestry work. I watched the needle jump sporadically and pretended not to notice. Near sundown, we reached the spot where I'd first seen the figure. There was a small depression in the soil where something big had stood. Not quite a footprint, more like pressure from weight alone. No claws, no toes. Just sunken, compressed earth. Surrounding it were small burn marks in the undergrowth, as if the air around the thing had been hot. Flynn called us over to the riverbank, where the missing hiker had left his last radio ping. We found his pack torn at the seams, contents half scattered in the mud. His journal was still inside, damp but readable. The last entry was a single line, scribbled in jagged handwriting. There in the trees, they never blink. That night, the chopper took the quiet guy and Flynn back. Malone insisted on staying, said he didn't trust the radio anymore. We bunked in the tower. He brought a hunting rifle, a field notebook, and a 5th of wild turkey. What do you think it is? I asked, watching the last orange glow fade behind the trees. He didn't answer right away, just stared at the treetops like he was watching something only he could see. I don't know, he said finally, but I saw something like it once, back in '97, same forest, different ridge. We lost a fire crew up there, never found him. Just scorch marks and melted gear. He took a long drink and offered the bottle. I shook my head. You didn't report it? He looked at me then, and I mean really looked, like he was weighing something. We did, he said. But the report vanished. DC shut it down. Told us it was a lichen strike, but that crew didn't burn. They evaporated. There's something under this forest, kid. Something old. We were never supposed to wake it up. Before I could ask what he meant, the radio crackled. Not a voice, not static. A sound, low and rhythmic. Like chanting, like humming that didn't come from any human mouth. And beneath it, a whisper that barely brushed the edge of hearing. Still watching, Malone stood up slowly, the blood draining from his face. "It's using our frequency." He grabbed the rifle and stepped to the window, scanning the trees. Then he froze. North tree line. 400 yards. Movement. I looked. Nothing but darkness. But then I saw it. 2 pinpricks of pale light, eyes, unblinking, fixed on us. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, didn't waver, just hovered out there in the dark like twin moons, faint and dead and impossibly still. I raised the binoculars with shaking hands. Through the lens I could make out a shape, tall, gaunt, not quite human. Its body rippled subtly, like smoke under water. A blur of something trying to wear a shape that didn't fit. Malone's voice was barely a whisper beside me. Same damn eyes from 97. He grabbed the emergency flare gun from the wall and fired. The shot hissed into the night, flaring red over the trees. For one breathless second, the whole ridge lit up like a photograph. And we saw it clearly, standing between 2 trees, one hand braced against a trunk, long fingers spread like talons. Its skin was pale and stretched thin over bones that jutted at wrong angles. Its chest didn't rise and fall. Its mouth wasn't a mouth at all, just a black slit, vertical and twitching. But the eyes, God, the eyes, glowing like dull headlights, watching us. As the flare fizzled out, darkness crashed back in. We lost sight of it, but the forest reacted. It went silent, dead silent. Then the air changed, turned thick, humming with pressure, like before a tornado. Malone barked, "Lights out." We killed every lamp in the tower, plunging ourselves into darkness. He pulled me to the ground. If it thinks we're gone, it might back off. But then the radio turned itself on. No one touched it, no power, no transmission button pressed. Just a sudden whisper through the speaker. The same voice as before, distant and wet, like something speaking through a throat full of mud. "You've seen me now." Then the scream came, far below the tower. Human, desperate. A woman. "Help, please." Oh, God, please. I was already up, heart jackhammering in my ribs. Someone's out there. Malone grabbed my arm, hard. "No, that's not a woman. That's bait." "What?" "It mimics. It learns. That voice, that's Rhonda Lee, from the 97 crew. She's been dead 20 years. The scream came again. Louder this time. Closer. Malone shoved a flashlight into my hand and hissed, "Whatever happens, do not open that door." The next 10 minutes were pure hell. We sat with our backs to the wall, weapons loaded, barely breathing. Outside, the scream circled the tower. Sometimes it sounded like a woman, sometimes a child. Once, horribly, it sounded like my own voice shouting for help. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. Then came the thud. Not on the ground. On the roof. Above us, we froze. Something was on the tower. I mouthed, "How did it get up there?" Malone's face was drenched in sweat. He didn't answer, just cocked the rifle and aimed upward. Boards creaked above us, then scratching, slow, deliberate. Nails dragging across wood. Then a thud on the balcony outside the front window. Something tall moved past the glass. A silhouette, broad-shouldered, head low, arms too long. It paused there, watching. Then came a sound I will never forget. A laugh? Low, imitative, broken, it was trying to sound human. Malone stood up, aimed the rifle at the window, and said in a flat voice, "Back off, you bastard." The figure tilted its head, curious. Then it whispered in my voice, "Please, help me. It's inside." That was enough. Malone fired. The window shattered. Glass exploded into the room. The figure vanished in an instant, not ducked or ran, just blinked out of existence. But as the echo of the gunshot faded, something new rose up from the forest. A chorus. Dozens, no, hundreds, of voices whispering in unison. A tide of tongues from the woods beyond. "You've seen use now." The pressure in the air intensified. The tower began to vibrate. Wood groaned, nails popped. Malone shoved a thick leather journal into my chest. "Take this. Get out. If the tower comes down, you run. Don't wait for me." "What?" "Go." Another blast of noise shook the tower. This time it wasn't voices. It was a horn, low, hollow, ancient. Something beneath us was awakening. I grabbed the journal and my gear, heart hammering so hard it drowned out everything else. Then I heard Malone yell something, and the floor buckled beneath me. The tower began to collapse, and I fell. I don't remember hitting the ground. I remember the fall, the tower breaking beneath me, the screaming wind, a sudden flash of trees spinning upward as I dropped into the blackness below. Then nothing. I came to hours later, sprawled at the base of the collapsed tower. My body screamed in pain, but nothing felt broken, just battered, bruised. Lucky, the forest was quiet, too quiet, and the tower, it was gone. A shattered mess of lumber and steel, torn apart like a toy dropped from the sky. Malone was nowhere, no body, no blood, just gone. I stumbled to my feet, half blind in the dawn light, clutching the leather-bound journal he'd shoved into my hands before it all went to hell. I didn't remember grabbing my bag, but it was slung over my shoulder, radio, flare gun, compass. My boots squelched in mud as I turned in a circle. Everything looked wrong. The trees leaned just slightly toward me, like they were listening, and the ground pulsed beneath my feet, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I needed to get out. I needed to run, but the woods wouldn't let me. I tried heading west, back toward the Ranger Road, toward civilization, but my compass spun wildly. No matter which direction I turned, it pointed east, toward the ravine, toward that cave. Something was drawing me there, dragging me. I fought it for hours, bushwhacking through underbrush, screaming for help, firing off flares until I had none left. But every time I checked the map, checked the sun, I was somehow closer to the ravine than before. I don't remember deciding to enter the cave, only standing inside it. The air was wet and wrong. The walls pulsed with veins of glowing fungus. The light was reddish purple, like a bruise on the world's skin. I followed the tunnel deeper. The walls closed in behind me. I could feel something under the rock, something ancient. Moving, I opened Malone's journal, desperate for answers. Inside were maps of the park, old ones drawn by hand, and a list of dates stretching back a century. Each one marked with a name. Most of them had been crossed out. Each entry had a number next to it. 72.3, 48.9, 11.0, 3.2, 0.1. The last one had no name. Just you, The final entry in the book read, "They don't live in the forest. The forest lives in them. The root below is their God, and it's waking up." I turned the page. It was a sketch, a crude one, but I recognized it, the creature, standing tall beneath a black tree with dozens of arms growing from it like vines. The root below is their God, and it's waking up. Beneath the tree's roots were bones, human bones, feeding it. Nestled in its trunk was a vertical slit, twitching like a mouth. Then I turned the last page, and there was a photograph, faded, curled with age. It showed the original ranger crew, maybe from the 1950s. 5 men and 1 woman, all in uniform, standing outside what looked like the same cave. The woman had her hand on the shoulder of a man I recognized. Malone, but he looked the same, exactly the same. He hadn't aged a day. I heard a sound then, a voice whispering from deep in the tunnel ahead. Not words, not exactly. It sounded like roots breaking stone. I kept walking, not because I wanted to, because I couldn't stop. The passage opened up into a vast chamber, bigger than a cathedral, its ceiling lost in blackness. And in the center stood the tree. It wasn't made of wood. It was bone and fungus and rot. Its roots pulsed like arteries. Its branches were filled with shapes. Some were animal, some were not. At its base I saw Malone. "Choose what?" I croaked. "Take the book. Take my place." The ground shook. The tree moaned. Roots writhed like worms. Something deep beneath the earth began to rise. I ran, back through the tunnels, up toward the surface, toward light, toward air. I don't know how I found my way, but somehow I did. I stumbled into the daylight, coughing and covered in black mud. The forest had returned to normal. Birds sang. A breeze stirred the leaves. The cave was gone. Just rock and moss and a sheer cliff face. I collapsed. 3 days later, I was found by a rescue crew. They said I'd been missing for 6 days. The fire lookout tower was declared destroyed in a storm. Malone was never found. I told them he ran into a bear attack, that he tried to save me. That's what they wanted to hear. But I kept the journal, and sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I hear something in the trees outside my window. Not footsteps, just roots, crawling across the floor of the world, looking for me. And in the dream, the tree is there, it's waiting, and one day I know I'll have to go back to take my place. Crawling across the floor of the world, looking for me. And in the dream, the tree is there, it's waiting, and one day I know I'll have to go back to take my place. My duties were basic trail maintenance, assisting lost hikers, checking permits, and occasionally helping the geologists still monitoring the slow heartbeat of the volcano. It was quiet work, and for someone like me, who'd spent the last 10 years trying to escape the noise of modern life, it was ideal. But something happened that summer, something buried, deep beneath the ash and moss and decades of silence, and I haven't been the same since. It started with a call from a research team monitoring geothermal activity in the northeast quadrant of the restricted zone. The area was officially off limits to the public, still considered unstable, full of sinkholes, gas vents, and soft ground. The geologists had gone radio silent after checking in at 6:14 a.m. on July 5th. I was sent out with a partner, Cole Drury, to investigate. We were given GPS coordinates and an order to report back by sundown. The drive up to the trailhead was uneventful. Quiet forest roads, morning mist hanging between the trunks like wet cobwebs. We parked just past a washout where the road gave way to broken pavement and moss. From there, we hiked the rest. I remember Cole cracking a joke about the sulfur in the air, said it reminded him of rotten eggs in Catholic school. I laughed. At the time, we were still normal, still clean. The hike took us through burned-out patches of forest and into older growth. The trees here twisted, bark blackened but alive. The underbrush was sparse, and the further we went, the quieter the forest became. Birds disappeared. Even the wind seemed hesitant. That kind of silence sticks with you, the oppressive kind. You don't forget it. When we reached the coordinates, the camp was still there. 2 tents, half-zipped. Equipment laid out neatly. No sign of a struggle. No blood. Just empty. We called out. Waited. Checked the perimeter. Nothing. Then Cole noticed something. The soil between the tents had sunken slightly, a shallow depression, like the ground had inhaled. He poked at it with a trekking pole, and the earth crumbled in, revealing a narrow hole, perfectly round, maybe 2 feet across, deep enough that our flashlights couldn't find the bottom. No scorch marks, no tools. No signs the team had dug it themselves. Something about it felt wrong. Wrong in a way I can't describe. Like it shouldn't have been there. Like it didn't belong to the world we knew. Cole said we should radio it in. I agreed. That's when the static started. Our radios had full battery top of the line, but every time we tried to transmit, we got static. Then something beneath it, not a voice, more like a pulse. A low, rhythmic thudding, faint, wet. Cole tried again. Then we heard the scream, not through the radio, from the forest, close. It wasn't human. I don't care what anyone says. I know what people sound like in pain. I've worked search and rescue. I've heard people with broken legs, punctured lungs, even one poor bastard who fell on his own axe. But this was different. It was a scream made by something that had learned how to sound human, but hadn't quite nailed it. Like a throat full of gravel and fluid, trying to imitate anguish. Cole took a step back. I took out my sidearm. We scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. Then came the second sound. Not a scream this time. Not quite. It was whispering from the hole. I leaned in. Flashlight gripped tight. And I swear to God, I heard my name. Not shouted, not echoed. Spoken. Daniel. My full name. My real name. Not Dan. Not Kessler. Daniel. No one out there should have known that we'd backed away, fast, packed nothing, left everything. We made it back to the station an hour after dark. We didn't talk the whole way. When we did, it was to say we hadn't found the team, that the zone was unstable, that there were signs of a sinkhole, that the forest was shifting. None of it was true. The next morning, a military convoy rolled up the logging road. Not U.S. Forest Service, not FEMA, no insignia. Just black trucks and stone-faced men in uniforms that didn't match anything I'd ever seen. They sealed the quadrant, hauled out the research gear, ordered everyone to keep clear. The official report said the geologists fell into a collapsed lava tube. No remains were found. No further questions were answered. Cole resigned a week later. I lasted another month. But sometimes, even now, I'll hear it again. When I'm alone, when the world's gone still, I'll hear the whisper like it's drifting up through the floorboards, through the earth. Daniel, something's still alive down there, still waiting, and I think it knows we're listening. My name's Casey Tolland, and 6 months ago I left my entire life behind. I had my reasons: a failed engagement, a dead-end job in the city, and a creeping sense that I was wasting my life watching the years stack up like paperwork on my desk. So when I saw the ad for a seasonal ranger position in the North Cascades, something about it pulled at me. Isolation preferred, solo post. Fire lookout tower needs manning for late summer season. Must be comfortable, alone in deep wilderness. Most people would have scrolled past it, but to me it sounded like salvation. The North Cascades are no joke. Rugged, towering peaks and thick forests that seem to breathe when the wind picks up. The tower I was assigned to Blanchard Ridge Lookout hadn't been used in over a decade. The district office said budget cuts had kept it dormant, but they wanted it manned again this season due to increased wildfire risk. The pay was nothing special, but it came with a solar-powered radio, rations, a cot, and a view from 8,000 feet above sea level. All I had to do was keep watch and be alone. The hike-in took most of a day. The trail was overgrown and barely marked. I saw no one. The tower itself sat perched on a rocky outcrop, looking out over endless pine forests and craggy ridgelines. It creaked like an old ship in the wind, but it was solid. Inside, dust covered everything, but there was a strange sense of calm. The first few days were blissfully uneventful. I'd wake with the sun, scan the horizon with the provided binoculars, and log my observations on an old clipboard. I'd hike a bit, read paperbacks I'd brought, or just sit and watch clouds roll over the valley below. It was the kind of silence that made you realize how loud the world had been. I started sleeping better. My thoughts felt clearer. But then the forest changed. It started with the trees. Not the color or shape, something subtler. A pattern. I'd noticed certain pines along the southern ridge had markings on their bark. Vertical slashes, evenly spaced. At first I figured it was claw marks, bears maybe, but they were too uniform, almost measured. I mentioned it in my nightly log over the radio, but no one replied. That wasn't unusual. The ranger office only checked in once a week. The next day I found another tree with the same markings. Then two more, all of them within a mile of the tower. And beneath one, half buried in moss, I found a ring of stones arranged deliberately. 5 of them, each with the same symbol carved into its surface, a crude circle with a single vertical line through it. I didn't touch it. That night, the woods felt too quiet. No wind, no owls, no rustling, just a blanket of silence so thick I could hear my own pulse. Around 2 a.m. I woke up with the uncheckable feeling I was being watched. I looked out the window, saw nothing, but when I stepped outside with my flashlight, the beam caught something in the tree line. Eyes, too high up for a deer, too far apart for a cougar, and then they blinked. The eyes blinked, and then they were gone. No sound. No rustling of branches. Just gone. I stood there for a long time, the cold night air biting through my flannel shirt, flashlight shaking in my grip. I told myself it was an animal. Had to be a bear, maybe. Or a moose. Something with eyes that reflected light. But something didn't sit right. Those eyes had been too steady. Like they weren't surprised by me, like they expected me. I stayed inside the rest of the night, radio clutched in my lap, static hissing like distant whispers. I didn't sleep. The next morning I made a decision. I had to check it out. Not just for my sanity, but because I couldn't shake the idea that whatever it was, it hadn't been passing through. It was lingering. I hiked to the tree line where I'd seen the eyes. The ground there was oddly clear, like something large had been pacing. The pine needles were disturbed, but no footprints, just impressions. Circular depressions in the soil, almost like hooves, but too wide, too deep. I pushed further in. I followed the trees with the markings deeper into the ridge's southern face. That's when I found the second ring of stones, larger this time, and older. Lichen covered them, but I could still make out the carvings. The same symbol. A circle with a vertical line through the center. This one had something in the middle. Bones. Animal bones arranged in a spiral. Carefully, ritualistically. I backed away, every hair on my arms standing up. I'd worked enough with park services in the past to know what scat, tracks, and kills looked like. This wasn't an animal kill. This was something else. I returned to the tower and tried the radio again. Tower 9 to base, over. This is Casey Tolland, Blanchard Ridge. I need someone to check in. Possible illegal activity. Ritualistic signs. Animal remains. Please respond. Nothing. The sun began to dip behind the mountains. The shadows crawled across the valley like spilled ink. And then the tower started to creak. Not just from the wind, this was different. Sharp, sudden, like weight, like footsteps. I went quiet, held my breath. 1, 2, 3 steps on the outer stairs. I stepped backward, flashlight off, back pressed to the inside wall. I could hear it breathing now, slow, wet, and deep. Then something scratched against the outer wall. Long, slow, deliberate strokes like claws or knives. Then silence. I didn't sleep that night either. By morning, whatever it was had gone. I checked the stairs. No prints, no sign of claw marks. But on the door, smeared in sap or blood, I couldn't tell, was that same symbol again. A circle with a line, and underneath, written in jagged block letters that hadn't been there the night before, "You should not be here." I didn't leave the tower for 2 days after finding that message. I kept the doors locked, moved my cot to the far corner, slept during the day in short, broken intervals, and kept watch at night. I heard it again, whatever it was. Never close enough to see, but always close enough to hear. The dragging steps on the gravel path, the breath, the scrape of nails on wood. And then there was the whispering. I thought it was the wind at first, but the more I listened, the more I realized it was language. Something guttural and wet, like it was being forced through a mouth that wasn't made to speak. On the third morning, I finally snapped. I couldn't just wait to die up here, not with that thing watching me. So I packed my bag, grabbed my revolver, the same one every ranger was issued, but never expected to use, and set out toward the southern ridge. toward the second circle of stones. I had to find out what it was, why it was there, and more importantly, why it hadn't killed me yet. I made it to the second ring by midday. The bones were gone. The stones had been rearranged, this time into a spiral that led downward into a shallow sinkhole I hadn't noticed before. There were stairs carved into the rock, crude, uneven, slick with moss and decay. My flashlight flickered as I descended. The air changed immediately. Wet, thick, like I was breathing something alive. At the bottom of the stairs, the tunnel widened into a cavern. There were more symbols carved into the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. The same circle and line motif, but more complex now, twisting into branches, roots, eyes, and in the center of the chamber stood something ancient. It wasn't a statue. It was alive, but barely. Huge, motionless, covered in bark and bone and moss, like it had been growing out of the earth for centuries. A forest god that time had tried to forget. Its head was crowned with twisted antlers. Its body slumped like a withered tree, and though its eyes were closed, I knew it knew I was there. All around it were piles of offerings, bones, old ranger uniforms, broken radios, teeth, pieces of stone etched with runes I didn't recognize. I felt something pulling at me, not physically, but mentally, like my thoughts weren't entirely mine anymore, like it was whispering directly into my brain. Return, obey, replace. Then its eyes opened, yellow, ancient, the same ones I'd seen blinking from the trees that first night. I turned and ran. I don't remember how I got out, just that I was back at the tower by nightfall, my flashlight dead, my hands bleeding from scraping against rock and thorns. I locked the door and waited for the sun. When daylight finally came, I used the emergency set phone hidden in the tower's supply chest, the one they tell you is only for worst-case scenarios. They didn't ask questions, just told me someone would be there by noon. When the truck arrived, it wasn't the Forest Service. It was men in unmarked uniforms. They didn't wear badges, didn't carry radios, just guns and clipboards. They didn't even look surprised when I told them what I saw. One of them, a man with a clean-shaven head and eyes that never blinked, asked me just one question. "Did it speak to you?" I lied, said no. I don't know why. Maybe because I knew I wouldn't be allowed to leave if I told the truth. They escorted me out, told me my contract was terminated for psychological instability, and warned me not to discuss what I saw for the safety of the public. The next day, Tower 9 was burned to the ground in a controlled fire. No mention in the news, no record of my employment, no investigation, but I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there, beneath the ridge, watching, waiting. Sometimes I hear it in my dreams, that voice dry and rotted, but patient, promising that it will return, that we were never meant to forget it, and now we won't. My name is Martin Holly, and up until last fall, I worked as a geologist with the Bureau of Land Management. I specialized in cave systems mapping, studying, and occasionally guiding survey teams through some of the lesser-known subterranean stretches of the American West. Most of my work was technical, dry even. Long hours of data collection, rock analysis, and plotting ancient fault lines. But the cave I found last October, if you can even call it that, was different. I was out in Nevada, just north of the Monitor Range, a few miles off Highway 50. The BLM had tasked me with investigating reports of sinkholes cropping up on remote parcels of land slated for development. Nothing unusual. Just another long, dusty solo trip through empty terrain. I'd parked my government-issued Jeep near a crumbling cattle fence and hiked out into the hills, topographical maps in hand, heading for a depression that had caught my eye on a recent satellite scan. The land out there is harsh, sharp ridges of volcanic rock, bristlecone pine scattered like forgotten centuries, and silence so absolute it presses against your eardrums. I didn't find a sinkhole. I found an opening in the earth that shouldn't have been there, a tear in the landscape hidden between weathered rock formations, maybe 5 feet wide, but deep, so deep that even with my high-lumen headlamp, I couldn't see the bottom. What struck me first was the smell, not just the expected mustiness of subterranean air, but something wrong, like old blood soaked into dry stone. It clung to my nostrils, metallic and thick. Normally I would have flagged the location, recorded coordinates, and moved on. But something about this place gnawed at my instincts. The edges of the hole were smooth, not jagged, worn down, almost polished. That's not how erosion works, not out here, not like that. And then I noticed the carvings, just below the rim, etched into the stone in a series of concentric circles, were symbols, old, weathered, unfamiliar. They didn't look like petroglyphs, at least, not the kind used by the indigenous peoples of the area. These were geometric, interlocking, and deeply etched, as if they'd been burned into the stone rather than chiseled. I should have left. Instead, I set up my rope and harness. I told myself it was for documentation, just a quick descent, a peek inside. I'd done it 100 times before. But looking back, it wasn't curiosity that pulled me into that hole. It was something else, something that wanted me to enter. The descent was immediate and steep, the kind of drop that doesn't widen, it narrows. After the first 15 feet, the rock walls began to curve inward, like a throat swallowing me whole. The beam of my headlamp barely touched the sides now, the darkness pressing tighter than any cave I'd ever explored. At about 40 feet down, my boot found a ledge. I adjusted my harness, steadied myself, and unhooked. The silence here wasn't natural. It was too complete. Even my breath seemed dampened, like the air didn't want to carry sound. That's when I noticed the walls. They weren't stone. Not anymore. They had a texture organic, almost ribbed, slightly wet to the touch. My glove came back with a dark smear that didn't look like dirt or mold, more like ichor. There was a smell again, stronger now, fleshy, coppery, rotting and alive at the same time. I should have climbed back up. Instead, I pushed forward into a tunnel that sloped gradually downward. The carvings continued along the walls, more frequent now, more intricate. Spirals and lines that seemed to twist if you stared too long. Words without sound, thoughts that weren't mine. Disjointed, backwards, wrong. I couldn't make sense of them at first, only that they repeated, echoed, grew louder the deeper I went. I passed through a narrow breach into a wider chamber, and that's when I saw them, figures, mummified, almost dozens of them, curled into the alcoves lining the walls, fused into the stone. Not buried, not laid to rest. absorbed, their faces stretched in silent agony, mouths frozen mid-scream, eyes wide and empty. Their skin was tight and waxy, pulled back against bone, and many of them wore clothing that didn't match. I saw modern boots, a utility belt, a backpack with a Bureau of Land Management patch almost identical to mine. I took a step back, and the ground moved beneath me. Not like a tremor, not like rock giving way. No, this was deliberate, a pulse, like something beneath the floor was breathing. That's when the whispering stopped, and a new sound started, a dragging, wet shuffle from the tunnel behind me. Slow at first, but steady, growing closer. Something was coming. I backed away, light shaking in my hands. My radio crackled to life for a second, just a hiss, like someone drawing a breath right against the mic, and then silence again. The thing that emerged from the tunnel wasn't entirely visible, just shapes limbs that bent wrong, a mouth too wide, and eyes like the ones I'd seen carved into the walls, almond-shaped, black as pitch, and ancient. It didn't walk. It flowed like it had no bones. I ran, I dropped gear, left my rope. I just ran through those winding, flesh-lined halls until I saw the faint glow of daylight up above. But the cave didn't want to let me go. The walls pulsed as I climbed, narrowing, trembling, trying to close in. My harness snagged, tore, I ripped myself free and scrambled up barehanded, fingernails snapping against the rock, legs screaming. I don't remember exactly how I got out. I just remember the light hitting my face and the feeling of something just behind me. And then silence, real silence, sunlight, the sound of wind again. When I stumbled back to the Jeep, my hands were shredded, my face streaked with blood. I drove straight to the nearest ranger outpost, but I didn't tell them what I saw. Just said I slipped into a cave and took a fall. They bought it. Mostly. One ranger gave me a weird look, though. A knowing one, like maybe I wasn't the first. Later that week, I tried to return with a team. I had to show them. But the cave entrance? Gone. Not just buried, erased. The rock had sealed over, smooth as if it had never been disturbed. I filed my report, marked the site unstable, a potential landslide zone. I couldn't tell them the truth. Hell, I could barely say it out loud. But I haven't stopped dreaming about it, because some nights I wake up hearing those whispers again, and sometimes when I walk too close to stone, I swear I feel it breathe.